I'm Susie Andrego. I'm a New Mexico Trees board member, and this morning I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ursula Schuch. Dr. Ursula Schuch is a University of Arizona professor and extension specialist with responsibility in environmental horticulture. She presents seminars and workshops for professionals in the green industry and conducts research to address relevant issues in horticulture production and practices and landscape management. Her research interests include irrigation requirements of trees and shrubs, abiotic stress and biotic threats affecting landscape plants, and minimizing inputs in nursery production and landscape management. Her current research projects include minimum irrigation requirements of shrubs and vines, pomegranate cultivars for Arizona, and witch's broom on Palo Verde. So we'll welcome Dr. Ursula Schuch.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of Think Trees Conference. This is an amazing event, and I cannot, compliment the organizers more on all the things that they have done and all the fabulous exhibitors. So, great opportunity for networking and for meeting, everybody who's interested in trees. So, I'm very happy to come from Arizona today and to share some thoughts about tree irrigation. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience who are in charge of tree irrigation. Would you raise your hand if you are the person programming the irrigation clocks in your park properties? Okay. And then I suppose the other people are relying on somebody like the experts that have raised their hands right now, right? So, I will be speaking. Let's see. So we'll be covering a number of things: how you estimate the landscape water use of trees, how you can figure out how much to put on, when to put it on, how long to put it on. So, when we're talking about the irrigation needs of trees, these are usually the questions you have. How much water? What is the irrigation amount? How often? What is the irrigation frequency? And how long? What is the irrigation duration? And then the water requirements, they differ. Of course, if you have a tree species that comes from a mesic environment, like a riparian species, that will need a lot more water than anything that comes from a xeriscape or a tree that is well adapted to the very drought conditions that they may have to grow under. Tree size matters, of course. The larger the canopy, the more water is required. The environment: is the tree growing in Las Cruces? Is it growing in Albuquerque? Is it growing in Taos? That makes a difference, of course, too. Then we need to know what was the weather like in the preceding number of days that you would lead up to another irrigation. And then also the soil properties matter. So we'll cover some of these things. The landscape irrigation needs, really you ask yourself, how much water do the landscape trees to survive? But then also, how much water do they need to thrive? And you all are probably in charge of some of the landscapes that need the trees to thrive and some where they just have to survive, depending on how the landscape is used. Is it a park? Is it like the back 40 where people don't really go around much, but you want to maintain that tree canopy? And essentially, the urban planners, they need to figure out how much water needs to be budgeted for these different landscapes. And then which trees can survive in case of a sudden water emergency or a drought or a heat wave and no irrigation. And this actually happened a number of years ago in some municipalities. There wasn't enough money to pay the water bill to water their trees, and so they just cut off certain areas, and the trees did not respond very well to that. So you have noticed probably there are a lot of tree planting initiatives, because if everything fails, the new trees will save the day. They will make the environment cooler. They will make our cities more livable. They will absorb all that extra carbon dioxide. And so a lot of people are banking on trees really making the world more livable and making it such that it is pleasant and it remains pleasant for all of us. So again, you have to think about what happens with all these trees. Very ambitious tree planting goals. You can see the city of Phoenix. They're trying to increase their canopy that was 10% in 2010 to 25% in 2030. Let's Plant Albuquerque, 100,000 new trees by 2030. The mayor has already started a lot of initiatives, showing these wonderful photos where they have the golden shovel and they're planting the trees and putting in that backfill. Tucson has pretty much surpassed everybody else I know for the size of city they are, and the mayor has a 1 million trees initiative by 2030. 1 million trees, think about that. Las Vegas doubled the average tree canopy from 10% coverage in 2008 to 20% coverage by 2035. So what does that mean? The pictures, the media coverage for all those new trees that are coming in, the trees being delivered, the trees being planted, dignitaries helping with shoveling in the backfill and everything. And then everybody is happy, everybody feels good, children help. But then who takes care of these trees, particularly the irrigation after they are planted? Because in our area, in the Southwest, we definitely need to have very reliable irrigation to get the plants established. And then the word was always, after establishing a desert adapted or a native tree for 2 to 3 to 4 years, depending on how fast it grows and the location, it can be taken off irrigation. Well, that is no longer true, because the drought, the heat, the temperatures overall, they have increased so much, and add to that the built urban environment that causes a lot of re-radiation and causes even more heat in those urban environments. So those tree planting initiatives are wonderful, but we also have to remember that the small trees take a long time. They can take decades, several decades, to give us the benefits, the ecosystem benefits of shade, of cooling the area, of filtering the air, and so on. Before they actually can do that, they have to be irrigated during that time. So what we should not forget is to take really, really good care of those established trees and prevent as much of the loss of the well-established large trees. This is something that sometimes gets lost in these tree planting initiatives that are wonderful, but that don't really help us in the next 10, 20, 30 years. The other thing is, have people budgeted, have the city planners, the county planners budgeted the homeowners for all that extra water they need to establish and then to maintain healthy, functional trees. So that's a big question. So I would propose that all of you get together and you're starting new initiatives. There will be the mayor's initiative. Today we're checking the irrigation uniformity of our parks. Today we're checking what is actually the soil moisture after an irrigation, to what depth have the trees been irrigated. So we need to really do a better job of making people aware that there is a lot of maintenance, diligent, day-to-day, week-to-week maintenance that is required. So when we're looking at a tree, the roots, they are located, they are usually spread 2 to 3 times the diameter of the canopy. And of course, it is recommended to have mulch over the entire root zone. Where do you water? You water inside and outside the drip line. You can see that. So essentially, you water in a donut shape, not right next to the trunk, because the roots right under the trunk, especially of larger trees, they are more structural trees, and more structural roots, and they don't really have the ability to effectively take up the water. It's the small roots, those feeder roots, that take up all the water. And so we don't need to have an emitter right next to a large trunk by the time a tree has grown to that size. And so you can see in the image up top right that there is irrigation that has been included, and then all these rings of irrigation, of inline drip irrigation, they should essentially cover the inside and the outside of the drip line, which is where we're projecting down from the outside of the canopy. So that's where we want to water the trees. So the irrigation basics, we need to know the plant water needs. We need to know the weather. What was the evapotranspiration, the loss of water from the plant and from the soil in the preceding weeks and months? What are the soil characteristics? What is the irrigation system application rate? So what kind of emitters do you have? Do you have 4 gallon per hour emitters? Do you have 2 gallon per hour emitters? And how many do you have of that? You want to irrigate the tree root zone to a depth of about 2 to 3 feet. You want to test your soil moisture. Use mulch, and in case there is a large application of water to be made, you want to make sure that you split your water application to prevent any runoff, because you want the water in the tree root zone where the plants can use it, not down the sidewalk or down some hill. The tree root systems, they are wide and shallow, and they are usually 2 to 3 times the canopy width if the area allows it. And the majority of the roots are located in the top 12 to 24 inches. So that is often surprising to people. And you can see in the image, this is after a very heavy storm that we had in the Tucson area, and a lot of very large trees came down. You can see that the roots are relatively shallow, down to 24 inches. And then also, there are not really some of those large tap roots that we sometimes see. Those occur mostly in nature when a plant germinates and is in a type of soil where the root actually can go down that way. So the reason why the roots are mostly in the top 1 to 2 feet is because that is where the moisture will come in, either from rain or from the irrigation. And that is also where the pore space and such is, so that this area will be reliably re-wetted. Further down, maybe there is some groundwater. Maybe if a tree is growing next to a higher groundwater table or next to a riparian area, then they may have access to a lot of water that is not coming in through irrigation or through the rain. Mulch. I'm really glad the previous speakers set up a lot of the points that I have to make, but it also tells you whether you're from New Jersey or from Arizona or whether you're from New Mexico. Mulch is really very important. You can see here this Palo Verde, it actually creates its own mulch. That's what people do, that's what trees do in nature. They create their own mulch by dropping the leaves, and they stay in place because usually, unless there is a very unusual weather event, that stays in place. The mulch will do all the job that the mulch that we put on in our urban built environments, and it does not have to be blown away, raked up, taken to the dump. It should be staying in place if possible. And it's even better if there were rocks, if there was rock mulch, if you remove that and replace it, maybe let the trees drop their own leaves. And again, there is a huge job of education to do to tell consumers and people that operate city parks and such, it's okay, it's wonderful, it's a natural thing for plants to drop their leaves and leave them in place. This is what plants are meant to do, to create their own mulch. And then, of course, you want to cover the entire root zone area if possible. 3 to 5 inches deep for trees, have the mulch away from the trunk, and then it does all these wonderful things. It conserves the soil moisture that goes in, and it also moderates the soil temperatures, keeps them warmer in winter and cooler in the summer. It can reduce runoff or erosion, and that is particularly important with these new weather events being so severe, where we have record rainfalls in very short amounts of time. And if there is mulch in place, especially mulch that may have been around for a little bit, and the bottom layer, the bottom area that touches the soil has already started to decompose a little bit, this will be the perfect conduit for that water to be held in the mulch, in that transition zone from the mulch to the soil and then into the soil. So you can essentially make sure you have your water there. And this process of the organic mulch breaking down also increases soil fertility, and it's one of the best measures to prevent from compaction. So if you have an area that is compacted, and if you can mitigate that compaction so that water and air can better penetrate into the soil, then adding mulch is a very good idea. So now we're looking at how water is used by the plant and how does it move through the plant. So the water loss is based on the atmospheric demand. So the area above ground has usually a relatively low humidity, and therefore there is constant demand for the tree to transpire water, to lose water through the stomata. And you can see the outside air, you know, it is very negative, whereas in the soil we have also a negative water potential, but at the same time it's not as negative. And so the water moves into the roots, and then it moves through the xylem into each of the individual leaves, and then the water is lost through transpiration when the stomata are open. Of course, the stomata are open during the daytime, because when we have sunlight, that is when photosynthesis occurs. And photosynthesis is the most important process, because this is what life on Earth is really based on, because without photosynthesis, we wouldn't have anything to eat, nor would we have any of the oxygen, the byproduct of photosynthesis. So the water is lost, and very little water is actually retained by the tree, but it is essential because it moves around all the different molecules, the carbohydrates, the proteins, it moves around the hormones, but at the same time, very little is actually used. There's this constant stream of water. And our job is, in the urban landscape, of course, to supply that water to the root zone so that the roots can be supplied, that water can be taken up, and that this whole process can keep going. Evapotranspiration is the combination of the loss of water from the canopy, from transpiration, and from the soil, evaporation. The term that is important for calculating irrigation demands is the reference ETO, and that is the loss of water from plants and soil where a cool season grass grows, so a relatively high water user. And this has been determined many, many decades ago, and essentially the water demands and calculating the amounts of water that are needed for different crops, this is all based on ETO. And now a lot of states have weather stations where they will give you your reference ETO for different areas. And it's calculated from the temperature, the wind speed, if there is any rain, of course, that then reduces the ETO and such. So, for example, the ETO in Albuquerque in June is 10.6 inches. So if you had a patch of warm season grass, that would lose 10.6 inches during the month of June, which is the month where you have the highest ETO demand here. However, you only get about 0.46 inches historical average of precipitation during that time. So if you had a plant that uses as much water as that cool season turfgrass uses, you would have to, approximately add 10 inches of water to that soil to make sure the plants are well hydrated. So the plant water use depends on the genetics of the plant. Are they desert adapted? Are they morphologically and physiologically adapted? And can they thrive with little water? Plants that have evolved in a mesic environment, like some of your riparian trees, the cottonwoods, and then of course, you know, New Mexico is a big state for pecan production. That is also a riparian tree, and it does really well, and it has amazing yields in this state, but you have to give it the water it needs. So in contrast, a lot of the xeric adapted plants, like you see in the images here, they have leaf adaptations. They have waxy cuticles, which makes them shiny and makes them kind of thick and a little bit hard. They have usually small leaf areas. You can see the compound leaf over there. And then you have leaves that have a lot of trichomes, the little hairs, that make the plant, that make the leaf surface look very fuzzy. All of these modifications are very helpful in preventing water loss, slowing down water loss. Water is still used, but at a much lower rate. So we're saying these plants have a much higher water use efficiency compared to a plant like a poplar, because they have large leaves and they don't have those modifications that will make them able to sustain and grow well for a long time in a dry environment. So the tree's ability of the roots to absorb water also have to be there. And that is why we're advocating for mulch, we're advocating for removing grass or any competing vegetation that would interfere with the uptake of water in the tree root zone, of course. So now how do we estimate the irrigation requirements? We need the plant's needs. We need the actual area that needs to be wetted under the tree canopy. But then we also need to know a lot of things about the soil. And we need to know what is the water holding capacity of the soil? How much water can I put on there in one irrigation and trust that it will stay in that top 3 feet and not a lot of it will just disappear below where the majority of the root zone is. What is the field capacity? What's that soil like when it is fully saturated but doesn't drain anymore? How much water can be depleted and still ensure healthy plant growth? And then how much water needs to be applied to restore the soil to field capacity? Because that's essentially what most of you are after when you're setting your irrigation clock. You want to put enough water on so the root zone is well hydrated. But how much is that? How many gallons or how many inches? Now, a little bit unrelated, but still related, because your irrigation system is the vehicle that gets that water into the soil. What is the irrigation efficiency of the system? So how uniform is that application? You know, do you have the 4-gallon emitter per hour actually deliver 4 gallons per hour through that emitter for the next 10 years? You know, how likely is that? And maybe there will be some that will deliver 8 because there is a little leak, and maybe some will deliver, you know, half a gallon per hour. So how equally is that water applied? So you can do an irrigation uniformity test. We won't talk about this, but this is all something that I think, you know, we should give these tools to people and make them a lot more popular than they are. And then water quality. If you live in an area where the natural salinity of the water is higher, then you have to worry about what happens to those roots. We have a lot of different plants that are adapted to drought, but that does not make them adapted to higher salinity. So for example, the desert willow, Chelopsis linearis, is a plant very well adapted to our dry conditions, but it does not tolerate higher salinity well. It will get marginal leaf burn, the older leaves will upsize, and it will have a much smaller leaf area and a much thinner type of canopy that really doesn't fulfill the functions of why we're planting that tree in the first place. So knowing the salinity, knowing your irrigation uniformity, and if you have higher salinity, you would want to increase the volume that you're adding so that those extra salts can be flushed below the root zone. So here we're looking a little bit at the soil physics and essentially how does the water move in the soil, what water is actually available to the plant. So 50% of the soil pore space is usually filled with air and water. When you have a lot of larger pores, the water moves through it relatively fast. If you have smaller pores, the water stays longer and it moves both a lot more horizontally but slower. So in these three images, you see we have the soil that is saturated. So this soil has either been irrigated or it rained on it. All the pores, which are the black part, are filled entirely with water, and you see water running off at the bottom. So that's at 3 feet below your root zone. There is still gravitational water movement, and that pretty much is lost probably to the majority of the trees because there are very few roots down there. When the soil then reaches field capacity, it does not drain anymore, and there are already some air bubbles in those pores, especially in the larger pores. And when you're moving then from field capacity to the wilting point where there is no more water available to the plant, there may be a little bit of water that surrounds the individual soil particles, but no more water is in those pores, so the roots that are growing in there have really nothing to get, and it's called the wilting point because the plants will wilt. They cannot hydrate anymore. So it is really good to know about your soil classification. Do you have a loamy, a clayey, or a sandy soil? And in that table on the right, you can see that a lot of those numbers, they go, if you have a soil that has a larger percentage of clay, your inches per foot per depth of soil that this soil can hold are between like 2.0 and 2.7. So the more clay you have, the more water can be held. And then if you move down the next couple of lines, you see the sandy soils. They have a lot less water capacity, holding capacity. And then below that, you see the ones that have more silt, which is in particle size intermediate between sand and clay. And then even though they have, you know, parts of the other sand and clay components, this is intermediate. So what does that mean for your management? It means that because the sandy soil has a lower water holding capacity, it has a lot of large pores. These pores will fill very quickly, so it's very likely you will hardly ever have any runoff from this kind of site. But at the same time, the water will move through very quickly. The plants have to be ready to take it up relatively quickly, and you would make smaller volumes of irrigation application more frequently because the water cannot be held as long as for some of the other types of soil. So here's another visual showing you how a soil that has more sand or more clay, what the wetting pattern looks like, you know, under a drip emitter. The sand, you have this very strong gravitational movement of the water down. For silt, you have it moving down, but also more horizontally. And for clay, it moves much slower because the pores are a lot smaller. So why is that important? It is important because of the rate of water infiltration. So how quickly can that soil hold that water that is applied and the water holding capacity? So water holding capacity we just covered. The rate of water infiltration is essentially if you're putting water with a drip emitter at 4 gallons per minute on there, can that soil take it? And if it's flat, maybe it will be just fine, but especially when you have drip emitters on a slope and you have a soil that has a higher component of clay, this can definitely be a problem. And not only will it cause runoff of your precious water, but it also can cause erosion. And so it's really bad because it can expose the roots. The water doesn't get to the roots, the tree will suffer. So that is why it's important to know about your soil texture. And then, of course, using mulch in these areas, you can prevent erosion and the runoff. But you could also split your irrigation application. Instead of putting all the water on in like a 4-hour or an 8-hour application for large trees, maybe you do two hours and 2 4-hour applications. So that's something to think about, where the more you know about your infiltration capacity, the water holding capacity, the more you understand your soil properties, the better you can use to manage them to keep the water where it's used most. How does water move in the soil? So it enters more rapidly if the top inch is dry, and if you have mulch, it will stay there longer and enter the soil better. And the soil, the water moistens the soil to field capacity before it moves further down by gravity. So that means when you have a soil that has a higher clay content, it takes quite a while for that water to move down. And we talked about runoff and erosion already, and the capillary water movement always goes from the zone of low tension, that is moist, to high tension. So the water wants to spread out. And of course, the roots also want to grow in these areas. And the water can move further in soils with the smaller pores than the larger ones, which you could see in that previous image of what the drip emitter patterns look like under different types of soil. Another thing is water will not move from a fine textured soil, let's say something that would be a potting soil that you would purchase to grow container plants in, into an area that is very coarse. So don't put large rocks or very large gravel underneath in a large container, because all that you're doing is you're reducing the root zone where the roots can grow. Some of those may grow down into that area, but the majority of the roots, they will stay, and essentially it's better to have a container then filled with a similar type, the same type of soil texture material. So now we're looking back at New Mexico, and we're going to the next factor after soils. Now we're moving to evapotranspiration. So what is the evapotranspiration in your state, and why do we worry about it? Well, all of you who are operating the irrigation clocks, you should know what ETO is for your location for each month. And then because we're in a very dry climate, we want to use water as well as possible. So we want to change the irrigation clocks probably at least 4 times for winter, spring, summer, and fall, because our ETO changes during that time. And you can see the temperatures and the rainfall in the top left graph. And that tells you that June is the month June is the month where we have the highest temperatures, which really drives the ETO. And then in the bottom, you can see 3 months of winter and 3 months of summer ETO. And I got this, this goes with that New Mexico pan evaporation map that is on the right. And you can see, of course, that in the southern part of the state, where it is a lot warmer, you have a lot higher pan evaporation over the course of the year, up like around 100 or over. And then if you're going to the Las Cruces area, it is less than that. So we need this information, we need ETO to actually calculate the tree water requirements. So this is a way to calculate the individual tree water requirement of one tree, where you have to know where you're at, because you have to figure out what is your ETO in the preceding month or so. And, or you can calculate it, for December, March, June, and then August, September again, for the different seasons to give it sort of a historic approximation. Then we have a plant factor. That plant factor tells you how much water does that plant use in relation to the cool season, to the warm season turf grass. So how much water would it use in comparison to that? Because that's our reference crop. And so a crop that would use the very same amount, that would be 100%, then your plant factor would be 1. And then the other part of this equation is, what is the area under the canopy? Because that's what we're using to calculate how much of the root zone do we want to wet. And that is the radius squared times 3.14, which calculates a circle, the area of a circle, and then the factor to convert the inches of water into gallons. That's what that 0.623 is for. So that's how we're calculating the tree water requirements. So let's talk a little bit more about that plant factor. If you've worked in agronomy, plant factor may be known to you as the crop coefficient. Some people have started to use landscape coefficient, but it's all the same. It's a dimensionless number that essentially tells you the fraction of how much water does that particular plant use in comparison to that warm season turf grass that determines your local ETO, your reference evapotranspiration. So coefficient of 1, the same, that plant uses the same amount as the turf grass. Coefficient of 0.5, it means it uses half of that reference crop. Xeriscape trees, they are estimated to use between 0.2, so 20% to 50%. And so essentially, I was using in this example the 50% because this is the example from the University of California that has put out this equation, and they say just use 50% for the trees that are generally adapted to a dry climate. And of course, you know, there are differences between coastal California and the desert area, but this makes it a little bit easier to grasp. So now let's look at what does that mean for a tree in Albuquerque. So over here we have a 20-foot diameter tree with a plant factor of 0.5 in June in Albuquerque. So we plug in the numbers. ETO is 10.6 inches, plant factor is 0.5. Our circle is calculated by, you know, the radius of 10 by 10 feet and then times 3.14, and then converting to gallons. We come up with that for that 4-week period, in order to replenish the water that has been lost based on these parameters, we would give this tree 1,037 gallons. Now that is a lot of water, and also June is hot. So you probably don't want to add all that water in one application because that would be a very long run time. So you want to probably split it into 2, means this is a well-established tree, and I'm sorry. Thank you. For some reason, the monitor here doesn't show that. Thank you. So, but you did all this in your head anyway, right? I mean, you're on it, no doubt. So you want to split this irrigation then in 2 weeks apart, which is a good thing because during that hot time, the plants need to have water to take up. And then how do you get that water on there? You can have an inline drip emitter like that, like the line that you place on the soil, or let's go with the fact you have your individual drip emitters. You have 12, which is approximately a recommendation for a tree this size. And then you're using the 4-gallon per hour emitters, and each emitter can, if you divide the 518 gallons per irrigation by 12, each emitter has to give you 43 gallons, which would make a runtime of 10.8 hours. So that's how you would apply the water to these trees in 2 irrigations during the month of June. Now, if you have a sandy soil, maybe you want to split it in 3 because otherwise too much water may be lost to gravitation below the root zone. So now let's look at a very well xeric adapted tree with a plant factor of 0.2. We run the same numbers and we come up with, we need to irrigate this tree with 440 gallons. A runtime, 12 emitters per 4 gallons per hour makes 9.1 hours for a single irrigation. But again, even though this tree does not need much more water, you always want to refill your tree root zone. You want to refill that area where your roots are growing and you don't want to wait too long. So probably you would split that one too. And monitor soil moisture after irrigation. So it's amazing that we're of the same mind. You know, our previous speaker, the long screwdriver, actually I have never seen one. We don't have one in my lab, but we do have the soil probes that we use, and we have other probes that the master gardeners are selling. You could also just use a rebar and put something on the top so it's easier to move. But monitor your soil moisture after irrigation because you want to know that the amount that is wetted is at least 2 feet, better yet 3 feet. So how do you place the emitters? Essentially inside and outside the canopy drip line. So you want to have that for the tree, that would be the 20-foot example, which you can see there. You can see it's a wetted area, and of course we cannot wet the entire area. Before, many years ago, we used to have a lot of areas, even landscapes, that were flood irrigated, and you will be surprised to know that in the Phoenix area there are still residential areas that get flood irrigation, which is just amazing. And there's a lot of grass there too and very lush trees. But the majority of the Southwest has switched to using drip irrigation or using other types of water delivery systems. And so as the tree ages, we want to move the emitter away from the trunk. You can see in the middle there, we have a 2-foot canopy, so a very young tree, single emitter. It's always better to have 2 emitters, just one on each side, because if one fails, at least the tree doesn't die. And then as the tree grows in diameter, the emitters are moved out. And so the best way to design a system is to design the system for what does this tree look like in 20 years when it has actually a diameter of 20 or 30 feet, and do all the calculations for, you know, how much pressure will you need to have 10, 12 more emitters in this area. So this is something that I don't think a lot of the planners that head and implement these planting initiatives do. They're planning for 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or luxurious 4 emitters per plant, and then this pretty much stays. And we have examples of where the emitter 2 inches from the base of the tree, which is where it was after it was planted, is actually still there 10, 20 years later. Now this emitter maybe will supply water, but it supplies it to those structural woody roots that cannot even take it up. So it's not a good situation there. And then just to give you another taste of how much water would be needed, so in the month of June in Albuquerque, a 4-foot diameter tree with a plant factor of 0.5 would use 41.5 gallons. And then would you split that into how many irrigations? Because this is a small tree, and you probably don't, definitely don't need to irrigate to 3 feet. You want to make sure at this stage that the tree, the original root zone, root ball, and the adjacent soil is wet. So in Arizona, we have the Arizona Municipal Water Users Associations. Those are cities of Phoenix and the surrounding cities. And they have done a lot of work on making recommendations for landscape watering guidelines. So you can get this online. Just go to AMWA, amwua.org, and they have a lot of information for the Phoenix area, for the low Arizona desert. And you can see they give you a lot of ranges for when you should water trees. Of course, we would want to water the trees that are desert adapted, and in spring, an interval between 14 to 30 days, in summer, 7 to 21 days. I mean, those are huge differences. Think about the amount of water that you would add. So you have to know about the soil, you have to know about all the other factors. You know, where exactly does your desert adapted tree fall? Does it fall into the area that we thought previously we never have to irrigate that again after 3 years? But maybe we should water it every 21 days, maybe just through the summer to make sure it is well hydrated. So these recommendations are right now in the process of being updated. And so we're trying to think about ways to help people to make good decisions and have healthy trees. So of course, everybody uses irrigation clocks. You want to group the plants by water needs. So all the plants that need to be irrigated to a depth of 2 or 3 feet deep, that would be trees, that would be large shrubs, that may be in some cases hedges, formal or informal ones, you want to have on the same zone. So they would be irrigated at different intervals. And you want to have your vegetable garden or bedding plants and shrubs and ground covers, you want to have all those on individually separated controls. And the controller will then accommodate the irrigation times and duration. And if you're using a smart controller, it will do that seasonal adjustment for you. But the smart controller is only as smart as the data that you feed it. And some of the smart controllers, for example, they have an irrigation override. So you had this epic rain of 1.5 inches, but nobody ever connected the rain gauge to that smart controller. So the smart controller may irrigate the next day because it didn't know there was that 1.5 inch rain event that actually should have postponed your irrigation for 2-3 weeks, depending on where you're at in the season. And then the other recommendation is you should only change your frequency of irrigation once you know what your water holding capacity is. So if you know it takes, in order to irrigate the depth of the root zone that you want to keep wet, it takes you 6 hours, let's say, for a particular area. Then you want to not change that time, but you just want to change the days. Maybe in summer you irrigate every 3 weeks, 2 weeks, maybe then in the winter, maybe you irrigate only every 6 or 8 weeks. And the idea is that you do not want to exhaust that, you always want to refill that root zone, essentially where you have to have the area moistened. And this is not that easy to calculate and to figure out because you may have a small tree on your irrigation system and you may have a whole bunch of very large trees. The small trees may have to be irrigated more often because they're still in establishment, but they are trees. So we have to use common sense to figure out what do these plants need exactly. And essentially, you always have to go by the plant that needs the irrigation most frequently, because if you let that one die, essentially, why did you plant it in the first place? What's the point of having it limp along and not be a functional, well-growing tree? So how do you get the water to the tree? So we looked already where individual emitters can be placed in that drip line donut, but you can also use inline drip irrigation. We have used that quite successfully, and In a way, it has been good because the animals that really like to chew on the irrigation lines, they have a bit of a harder time to bite through these lines. They are a little more sturdy. So the emitters are integrated into those hoses, and they can be every 12 inches, 18 or 24 inches. You can buy them with different specifications. And depending on the water pressure, then they will have a certain water delivery. So you have to figure out for your system, you know, how big the lines that go to your distribution system have to be. How many emitters do you have, you know? If you have a very small line, maybe you can accommodate 100 emitters on one of these systems. But if you need 450 for your one area, or if you need even more for a park area, you have to break it down into smaller zones. So you want to make sure you know what your application rate is. The advantage of this is it allows a pretty even application over an area. And then when we're talking about, you know, we want to water that donut, exactly how much do we want to water it? So the Irrigation Association recommends 75%. So when you're looking at the tree that is surrounded by these 3 circles of inline drip lines, you can see if that canopy would be just between the 2nd and 3rd circle, that would water probably a pretty good area, 75%. But many times when we have larger trees, it gets a lot more complicated and it gets a lot more difficult to water that area. But if you could shoot at trying to wet anywhere between 60 to 75% of that root zone in that donut, that will be very good for sustained tree health. So you can have these on-surface applications that you see in the image here. We have also used them for subsurface, and that is becoming popular with some of the orchards. And it's nice because you can still see after the irrigation the zone of wetting, so you can do a check. But once you put mulch on it, then you really have to go and either scrape away the mulch, or you have to look at you have to look at how much of that area has been wetted effectively. So it gets a little bit more tricky instead of seeing over here exactly when things are on. And then of course you come in with your soil probe or your long screwdriver and you're checking how deep has the irrigation actually gone. This is the typical point source drip irrigation that is used in, for a lot of shrubs, for some of the trees, and it can be widely spaced. You can have a single drip irrigation or a single drip emitter, or you can have a hub that has anywhere between 4 to 8 spaghetti lines that can be installed on that. And this one conserves water because as long as it functions correctly, it will apply the water directly where the plant roots are, where you're guiding it to. And the emitters, they come in different application rates, you know, ranging from 0.5 to 4 gallons. The mini or micro sprinklers, they distribute the water in a spray very close to the ground. So you do have a little bit more loss to evaporation when you're using those. They're usually operated at night or in the morning. They're very popular for orchards, and it can wet a larger area of the root zone compared to an individual drip emitter. And it is becoming more popular in some of the orchards, like in Arizona, some of the people have been using it in some of the pecan orchards now. The soaker hose, mostly a temporary measure. This is something where you have the hose that essentially drips the water out, and it's very flexible because you can put it anywhere on top of the surface where you need it, and it's better than a single hose that just, you know, waters a very small area. It's also great when you have an emergency, for example, an area of the irrigation doesn't work well, but you still need to preserve your trees. And you have to look at how, you know, it's much better to have a permanent functioning irrigation system than having the soaker hose, but it's definitely a help. Bubblers are another way to administer the water to the irrigation to a landscape. Those deliver large volumes of water, for example, 2 gallons per minute. So they have a very short run time. And often you have a basin because you have that fast delivery rate. The advantage is you see the water is coming in there, but you have to make sure it does not run off and away from the area where you want it. So the basin then needs to be enlarged and adjusted, and you could have different donuts around the tree, considering where the drip line is, and expand those and then essentially close some of the ones that are closer to the ground as the tree grows. So that's another opportunity. So now we're coming to some brand new things that are available for sale on the internet. And after everything you know, I would just like to see a quick thumbs up or thumbs down if you would spend money on that. Okay. Were there any thumbs up? Any thumbs up? So you will be amazed. I was frankly a little shocked to see that. And of course, we all know what the problem would be, you know, having the trunk wetted all the time and having that water right there in that little area. I don't know who designed this, but I don't think they were familiar with trees, tree health, or how you apply water. So, okay, you're still with me, I can tell, so that's good. So when you irrigate trees after planting, you want to make sure to keep the root ball of the plants moist, because that original root ball is comprised of organic media, and that organic media can dry out very quickly, and then it can become hydrophobic if you allow that. And then you also want to put the water a little bit outside that original root zone so the tree can establish and grow into the surrounding soil. So you want to place the emitters on the root ball, but install more to move away. And again, you want to consider the soil type, and watching that soil moisture is really important at that time. You want to separate the turf from other plants for irrigation and maintenance, of course. And then the signs of underwatering. This is when the soil is dry in the lower root zone, old leaves turn yellow, and we get a thin canopy because some of the water is essentially not available, and the plants will shed canopy. Signs of overwatering: the soil is constantly damp, and the leaves turn light yellow or green, young shoots can wilt, and having trees grow in turf is always tricky. Some trees can tolerate it, but there are some desert trees that absolutely cannot tolerate it, and they will die. The Mediterranean plants are particularly susceptible to winter drought in Arizona and New Mexico, and they require irrigation year-round. And here you can see some trees. Neither one of them is around anymore, but obviously in that small strip between the wall and the sidewalk, these trees never got enough water. And then as the temperatures heated up, they eventually just died. Then, of course, we know that plants can become more susceptible to drought, and that happens when we have sustained drought. The plants are stressed, like these pines over here. And a couple years ago, we lost a lot of trees to the pine engraver beetle. And it's interesting because the pine engraver beetle used to be only in the mountainous areas, and it is native to Arizona. And then it moved down into the lower desert, where it then populated a lot of the pines that are not native. So, you know, often we have the opposite. Some kind of non-native pest may come in and affect the native plants. Here, the native pest comes in and essentially takes out a lot of the trees that were introduced. And they used to grow very well. We used to have a lot of Elderica pines. But people have not paid attention to the ETO, to those extreme temperatures in order to make sure the plants can grow well. And you can see those 3 pines there. The middle one died first, had the bark beetle first, and then within a few months, all the other trees died too. So soil and water factors that contribute to water stress, essentially anything if the irrigation system isn't working well, if you don't apply enough water, water holding capacity of the soil is not taken into account. All of that will affect essentially how the plants can operate. And then above ground conditions, in the built environment, we have a lot of re-radiation, single trees isolated in a parking lot, trees exposed to reflected heat, or in some cases, we more often now have these microbursts that just take out trees that are not as well rooted. And so we lose a lot of trees that are actually already several years old. And the species sensitivity, of course, and you know a lot about that already. After turf conversion, you cannot just put in 12 drip emitters and hope a tree that had this extensive root system in turf can now function. So we have done a study on how to maintain healthy trees with minimum water, and it's essentially looking at 9 different species. So there is a cooperative extension bulletin where you can see all the results. And we used a lot of the native and some desert adapted trees. A lot of those would actually grow over here too. And then we used different irrigation regimes, wet, medium, and dry. And for the wet one, we irrigated those trees at 80% ETO from May to October, and 60% for the medium and 40% for the dry, and then half of that during the winter season. And this was just southwest of Maricopa County. And then here is an example of how often, based on ETO and these criteria, the plants were irrigated. And you can see in the summertime, the trees under that wet irrigation, they were irrigated every 4 days because we have a very high ETO in that area. And the dry ones every 12 days. And then when you're looking at the longest interval between irrigation, which is of course in the winter time, it was 163 under the dry conditions and 124 under the wet. So would you ever dare to grow your trees, essentially with 4 months and no irrigation? Here in Albuquerque, probably, but I don't know about Las Cruces, how some of the trees would do. And then here you can see what the trees looked like after 3 years of treatment. And those were the ones that did well. But you can see the conifers, they did not fare quite as well. And then after 4 years of these treatments, we added 1 year of drought. We pretended we didn't have an irrigation system anymore because remember, we can just take some of these trees off irrigation, right? Even in Maricopa by Phoenix. Well, no. You can see that the Afghan pine, the Rio Grande ash, and the Arizona cypress did not like that at all. And then the Texas ebony also, even though it did well under the low water regime, they could not handle being taken off that irrigation fast. And remember, that's a Chihuahuan native tree. So even though they do well, you cannot just take anything off irrigation fast. And here are some tree cookies, and the long and short is we did not get any differences in growth over those 5 years of treatment. And then we looked at the trees, at the roots. Our hypothesis was that the roots of the trees that are irrigated under the dry irrigation, and if the trees are still doing well, they will have deeper roots, they will have more fibrous root system, and they will overall have more of a root system because we know under stress, trees allocate more carbohydrates to the roots than to the shoots to deal with it. Well, we did not find any differences there. We measured a lot of parameters, and you can see that these trees did not really work with our hypothesis. And Then here's just one example to show you the tree rings. We measured those. And you can see the black arrow in the graph shows when the irrigation treatment started that I just told you about. There was no difference in the treatments among, you know, the wet, medium, and dry of those trees. And you can see what the tree canopies looked like. The pistache red push was one that worked really well. But you can see even after a couple of years on the bottom right, the canopy is getting thinner. So the trees that did well are Palo Verde mesquite, red push pistache, desert willow, Texas ebony, and we would recommend to irrigate them at 40-20% ETO summer, winter. And then the ones, the live oak needs about 60-30, and the Arizona cypress, the Afghan pine, and the Rio Grande ash, they need 60 to 80%. They are high water users. So, and the drought, essentially all the trees did well except the Texas ebony of the ones that did well before. So using desert adapted trees is really a good thing, but we can't count on not watering them forever. And essentially for water conservation, you can use the precision landscape irrigation. Check your uniformity, use alternative water sources. Even rainwater harvesting with some of these big rains can be useful. Low water use landscapes, and in drought conditions, water the trees adequately. To sum it up, and now everybody is an expert on irrigation, right? Management practices in drought and extreme heat, slow deep irrigation, 2 and beyond the drip line, 2 to 3 feet deep. And don't overwater, use the moisture gauge and soil probes, use drip irrigation or soaker hose to get that water where it is. Always prioritize trees. You can always replace a shrub or bedding plants or something, but a tree is very hard to replace. And no fertilizing, no extra pruning. And always prioritize tree irrigation. And I'm closing with this fabulous pamphlet that is available and that the previous speaker has already alluded to that website too. You have a lot of information about how to water the trees in dry climate. And thank you for sticking with it. Here is your reward for those of you who need that.